Hey, what's up, everyone? It's Carter, and today I'm going to fill you in with some educational art. In this episode of Educational Art, we're going to be learning about the Asian slave trade, African slave trade, and American slave trade between 1450 and 1750. We're going to be comparing and contrasting these, seeing their economic, political, social, and environmental impacts as well. Let's kick things off by talking about the American slave trade's social aspects. Most slaves were brought into America through ports in New York. Up to 35,000 a year were brought in. A key element to review when discussing the American slave trade's social aspects is the fact that some slaves were actually just indentured servants brought from Europe. An indentured servant was someone who wanted to come to America but couldn't pay for it, so they would enslave themselves to someone who would pay for them to come across in return for a certain amount of work. Two effects that slavery had were that the black population increased a lot, and the efforts of restriction of slavery led to a divide in America between the North and the South. The North supported anti-slavery, the South supported slavery and needed it for their wealth. Later on, this led to the Civil War. The main economic purpose for the American slave trade was, of course, money, because who doesn't like money? People who were enslaved were treated horribly, as if they were cargo. They were treated so bad that about 1.6 million of them died in transit to the Americas. The reason people needed slavery was because of a free labor force, and that made the American economy center around it. While Abraham Lincoln wasn't busy hunting vampires, he was actually working very hard to free all the slaves, and in 1863 he signed the Emancipation Proclamation freeing all slaves. To help you guys understand the American slave trade's political aspects, I made an acrostic, which I didn't even know was what this was called until I just Googled it 5 minutes ago. An important note to make when discussing this is that even the American presidents owned slaves, and other people in power owned slaves. For example, Andrew Jackson owned over 180 slaves at his house at one time. By 1775, Quakers had started an anti-slavery club because they decided they'd had enough of people being treated so unfairly in America. In 1788, over 13 of these clubs existed, and other secret ones were widespread across the United States.
But wait, you never told us when the Civil War happened.
Are you trying to send me to jail for child abuse? This is an AP class. You need to read your text or leave. Sorry about that small outburst. Let's continue, shall we? Next, we're going to talk about the American slave trade's environmental effects. Now, the slave trade at first started with plantations, which caused a lot of lumber or trees to be cut down to make room for them. And later on down the road, it actually led to a lot of factories and stuff like that, which polluted the air. Now let's talk about the social effects that slavery had in Africa. Now, originally, slavery was warfare between tribes, and they would enslave the losing tribe, basically. This also had economic effects because they would sell them to the Europeans for money. Individuals who were going to be sold into slavery were transported to the coastline first because Europeans did not want to go inland for fear of disease. The main economic aspect of the African slave trade actually has to do with America and Europe as well. It was the Triangle Trade Route, one of the largest trade routes at the time. The way it worked was the Europeans would trade goods in Africa for slaves, and then they would trade the slaves in America for goods, and the triangle just goes on forever. Basically, being an elite and being able to sell slaves made you rich. Here are the environmental impacts that slavery had on Africa. They're pretty similar to America in the sense that trees were cut down to make room for like ports and stuff on the coast. But they do have a slightly different um, thing in that people who lived on the coast were all getting sold out to slavery. So they started moving more inland and it caused a denser population in the center of Africa rather than the coastline. Now at this point, Africa's society is crumbling. People actually took an animalistic approach towards their neighbors and everyone and preyed on them to sell them to slavery. They showed Darwinian behavior. There was more tribal warfare. Tribal leaders captured other people and sold them because of the money that they could get from it. Darwinian behavior refers to what Charles Darwin said was survival of the fittest. It has to do with Africa, because if you couldn't defend yourself, then you would be sold into slavery. Now we're going to move on to our final trade route for slaves, the Asian slave trade. In 1460, the Ming dynasty crushed a rebellion by the Miao dynasty. As punishment, the Ming dynasty decided to castrate thousands of men who rebelled against them. Now, obviously, I'm not going to show pictures of that because that would be pretty gross. The people they castrated and enslaved were called eunuchs, and most of them actually died in the process of being castrated because of poor medicines. The reason they did this to these men was to show their dominance over them, not just to enslave them. They wanted people to fear them. By 1565, the practice of enslaving and castrating men got a little bit out of control. In the Qing dynasty, they decided that they should put a heavier tax on slave owners and limit the number of slaves people could have per household. An important thing to note is that, again, the slave trade in China at this time was more about dominance, not about need for actual slaves. What you're about to see is a real quick review over everything that was covered in this video. Feel free at the end to take out your phone and take a picture if you just want a complete review over everything discussed. Thank you everyone for watching. I hope you have a